The 41st floor of Park Tower had hosted 1,000 mornings exactly like this one, and every single one of them had gone the way Theo Park decided it would go before he ever walked through the door. That was simply how it worked. Executives rehearsed their pitches twice, once for the room, and once for the silence that came before Theo Park said the one sentence that would decide everything. Today the room looked the way it always looked. 12 people around a glass table. The Miami skyline behind them, blue and endless. A chair at the head of the table that somehow felt more occupied when it was empty than most chairs felt with someone in them. Then Amara Whitfield stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam the folder shut, though she could have 11 months of community surveys, design renderings, budget models, the kind of work that usually took teams twice the size of hers twice as long to produce. She simply closed it. Then she unclipped her visitor badge and set it on the table, face down, the way you'd set down a card you no longer wanted to play. "I appreciate the opportunity," she said, to the room, to the glass, to the city outside the window that didn't care either way. "But I won't be the person who explains to 3,000 families why their homes were the cost of a better view." And then she walked out. Nobody in that room had ever seen anyone walk out on a Park Holdings deal. People had cried in that room. A man had once fainted in that room, 4 years ago, during a hostile takeover vote that didn't go his way. But nobody, not a single person in 15 years, had ever stood up, returned what the company had given them, and left like an 11-figure project was the least interesting thing happening to them that day. At the head of the table, in the chair that was usually empty, Theo Park sat very still. For exactly 4 seconds, his face did something it had not done in any photograph, any press conference, any boardroom in 15 years. It changed. To understand how it got to this, how the man the financial press called the Glacier ended up sitting in stunned silence while a woman from a 2-bedroom house in Liberty City walked out of his building without looking back. You have to go back. 3 months back. To a folding chair in a community center with bad air conditioning, on a Tuesday night that nobody important was supposed to care about. If that sounds like your thing, hit subscribe now because this story only gets better from here, and you do not want to miss what he does later. Amara Whitfield was 34 years old, and she had spent most of those years being underestimated by people who would later pretend they'd seen her potential all along. She ran a 6-person design firm out of a converted storefront in Overtown, 3 miles from the house where she grew up. Whitfield Collaborative didn't have a glass tower or a logo anyone outside Miami's planning circles would recognize, but it had something most firms twice its size didn't: a finished project that people actually used. 2 years earlier, Amara had redesigned a half-acre park near the Miami River that the city had been studying for renovation for over a decade. She'd done it by spending 4 months before she drew a single line just sitting in that park, talking to the people who used it, the domino players, the mothers with strollers, the teenagers who cut through it on their way home from school. The result wasn't flashy. It was exactly what the neighborhood had asked for, down to the shade trees positioned where the domino tables already were. People still called it Miss Amara's Park, which made her laugh every time, because she hadn't designed anything from scratch. She'd just listened, and then drawn what she heard. That park was the reason Park Holdings, a Korean conglomerate with more capital than most small countries, and a real estate division currently assembling the largest waterfront redevelopment Miami had seen in a generation, had hired Whitfield Collaborative for the community engagement phase of a project called Bayshore Rising. Amara knew exactly what that hire was on paper. It was optics, a massive foreign-owned development company buying 11 months of goodwill from a black-owned local firm before the real decisions got made by people who'd never set foot in Liberty City. She knew it, and she took the contract anyway because 11 months of real community input, even if it ultimately got filed away, was 11 months more than these communities usually got. And because the street the project's Liberty Corridor component would touch was the same street her grandmother had lived on for 52 years. The Tuesday night town hall was the 4th of 6 scheduled community sessions, held in the multipurpose room of a community center with air conditioning that worked in cycles. 15 minutes of relief, 10 minutes of nothing, repeat. Folding chairs in 3 different colors, because the center had been donated chairs by 3 different churches over the years and had never been picky about matching. Amara had given this same presentation 3 times already and would give it 2 more times after tonight, and she gave it now with the same care as if it were the first time, because the people in the room had not heard it 3 times. For most of them, this was the only chance they'd get. She walked the room through the renderings, a community center renovation, a small public plaza, housing that would sit alongside the existing blocks rather than replace them, at least in this draft. She answered questions about parking, about construction timelines, about whether mixed income actually meant what people were afraid it meant. About 40 minutes in, during the Q&A, an elderly man near the back raised his hand and started to speak, and then stopped, frustrated, tapping the side of his head. Earl Curtis was 78 years old and had run a small appliance repair shop 2 doors down from Amara's grandmother's house for as long as Amara could remember. His hearing aid had died mid-sentence, and he knew it, and the room knew it, and for a second the room did what rooms do. Looked away, gave him space, moved on to the next question, the way you politely don't notice someone's struggle so they don't feel embarrassed by it. Amara didn't move on. She stepped down from the small platform at the front, walked the length of the room, past the folding chairs, past the rolling cart with the projector cable taped to the floor, and crouched down next to Mr. Curtis. She didn't make a show of it. She reached into the outer pocket of her bag, where she kept a small case of hearing aid batteries because she had learned, 3 meetings ago, that at least one person in every room needed one and never had it on them. She swapped the battery in under 30 seconds, said something quiet that made him laugh, and then stood back up, but instead of returning to the front, she stayed beside him. Mr. Curtis was about to ask about the alley access behind Northwest 62nd, she said to the room, as if she'd heard the whole question, which she had, because she'd known what he was going to ask before his hearing aid died. She'd heard him talking about it to his neighbor before the meeting even started. That's actually one of the most important questions tonight, so I want to make sure everyone hears it. And she answered it. In full. By name. In the back row, in a plain gray button-down with no logo and no name tag, a man sat very still and watched this happen. He had introduced himself to the community liaison at the door as Tay, an independent consultant doing an assessment on behalf of one of the project's investors, which was true in the most absurd way possible, because the investor in question was himself, and the assessment was something he did personally, privately, before every major decision his company made, a habit he'd inherited from his father for reasons that had stopped having anything to do with his father a long time ago. His father had done site visits to find leverage. Theo did them because somewhere in the last several years, the numbers on a page had stopped meaning anything to him, and he needed to see with his own eyes what those numbers were actually attached to before he signed his name beneath them. He had been to 11 of these kinds of meetings across 4 continents over the years. He had never seen anyone do what the woman at the front of the room had just done. Not because no one was capable of kindness, but because everyone in rooms like this one, when they knew someone like Theo Park might be watching, performed. Even the kind gestures were performances. He had learned to spot the half-second glance toward the important people in the room that came right after someone did something generous, the little check to see if it had been noticed. Amara never glanced anywhere. She didn't know anyone important was in the room. She fixed an old man's hearing aid because the meeting couldn't function without it, and then she kept going, and the entire exchange took maybe 90 seconds, and nobody applauded, and she didn't seem to expect them to. Theo Park had spent 15 years being told, in 100 different ways, what he wanted to hear. That night, for the first time he could remember, he sat in a room and watched someone do something good simply because it needed doing, with absolutely no idea that it was being watched at all. He stayed after the meeting ended. Most of the room cleared out within 10 minutes. People had jobs to get to in the morning, kids to pick up, buses to catch. Amara stayed behind to fold up the rolling cart and gather the leftover handouts, and when she turned around, the man in the gray shirt was still there, looking at one of the renderings pinned to a corkboard near the door. "The courtyard," he said, without turning around. "You've got it oriented east-west instead of north-south, even though north-south would fit more square footage." "Why?" Amara blinked. In 4 sessions, across maybe 200 attendees, exactly 0 people had asked her a question about orientation. "Because east-west means the domino tables get morning shade and evening shade, and miss the worst of the afternoon sun," she said. "Nobody's going to sit out there from 1 to 4 anyway. So I designed for the hours people actually use it, not the hours that look good in a rendering." He turned around then, and for the first time she got a full look at him, tall, dark hair, unremarkable in the specific way that very expensive, very simple clothing can be unremarkable if you don't know what you're looking at. He had a kind of stillness to him that she'd later think about a lot, the stillness of someone who'd spent a long time being looked at and had learned to give very little away while being looked at. Most people would have maximized the square footage, he said, and then put a plaque up explaining why it was actually better this way. Most people don't sit in the courtyard, Amara said. I do. They ended up talking for 40 minutes after that, long after the last volunteer had locked up the side rooms and the building manager was visibly waiting by the light switches. He asked good questions, real ones about phasing, about how she'd handled a similar project in Overtown, about what happened to community input once it left a meeting like this one and entered a boardroom like the ones he sat in every week, though he didn't say that part. She found herself talking more than she meant to, about her grandmother, Miss Odessa, who still lived on the block the project would touch, who'd been growing bird of paradise in a row of coffee cans on her porch for as long as Amara had been alive. About how Amara's biggest fear wasn't that the project would fail. It was that it would succeed beautifully for everyone except the people who'd been there the longest. Tay didn't offer much about himself, and Amara didn't push. He said he'd grown up moving constantly, never really had one place that was his the way Liberty City was hers. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that he restored old houses, privately as something close to a hobby, though hobby felt like the wrong word for something he'd been doing quietly for over a decade. Old wiring, bad foundations. Things people give up on too early, he said. And there was something in the way he said it that made Amara look at him a little longer than she meant to, though she couldn't have said why. She noticed, too, that when he was thinking, really thinking, working something out, he turned a plain band of a ring on his right hand, the only thing about him that didn't look new. She asked about it once, weeks later, over coffee near the project site, one of 4 or 5 times Tay turned up at follow-up walkthroughs that, on paper, had nothing to do with an outside consultant's scope. My grandfather's, he said. He was the only person in my family who ever built something with his hands instead of his name. She filed that away the way she filed away most things people told her, carefully, without quite realizing how much weight it would carry later. Over those weeks, something happened that Amara didn't examine too closely at the time, because examining it felt like it might make it stop. Tay showed up. Not every day, not in a way that felt like pursuit. More like he simply existed periodically in the orbit of the project, asking good questions, remembering answers to questions he'd asked 3 weeks earlier, the kind of remembering that most people, even people who liked you, didn't bother with. He remembered that Miss Odessa's porch had 3 coffee cans, not 2. He remembered that Amara took her coffee with too much sugar and pretended she didn't. He remembered, when she mentioned once, almost as a joke, that the community center didn't have anywhere quiet. No reading room, nothing, just folding chairs and bad AC. That she'd said it like it mattered to her, even though she'd moved on to the next sentence before he could respond. On the last evening before he told her he had to leave, a board commitment, he said, vague in the specific way that made Amara assume it was something boring, an audit or a shareholder call, he walked her to her car after a late site visit. The parking lot was empty except for the 2 of them and the kind of Miami evening that smells like rain that hasn't started yet. He stood there for a moment longer than the conversation required. When I'm back, he said, there's something I need to be honest with you about. Amara laughed a little because it sounded heavier than the moment seemed to call for. Honest about what? That you're actually terrible at orientation and you've just been agreeing with me this whole time? He almost smiled. Almost. Something like that. Then he left. 2 weeks passed. Amara, buried in final presentation prep for the biggest contract her firm had ever landed, didn't think much of it, until the night she turned on the news with the television running in the background while she finalized slides, and saw a headline that made her set down her coffee very slowly. Park Holdings chairman Theo Park returns to Miami ahead of Bayshore Rising final vote. And there he was, getting out of a car, cameras flashing, a face that did not move, the face of a man the anchor described, almost admiringly, as famously private. Park has not given an interview in over a decade, and is known internally as the Glacier for his demeanor in negotiations. Amara sat very still for a long time. If you felt that exact moment when something clicks into place and you realize it's so much bigger than you thought, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It helps this story reach more people, and trust me, you're going to want to talk about what happens next. Amara didn't call him. She didn't know which number would even reach him. The one she had was for Tay. A number that, she now realized with a kind of slow-motion clarity, could have been anything, a burner, an assistance line, anything. She thought about confronting him. She thought about pulling out of the presentation entirely, letting someone else from her firm present so she wouldn't have to be in a room with a man who had spent weeks letting her believe he was someone who simply listened, for free because he wanted to, when the truth was he'd been the only person in the building whose opinion had ever actually mattered. But 11 months of community survey work didn't belong to her feelings. It belonged to Mr. Curtis and Miss Odessa, and 200 people who'd shown up to folding chair meetings on Tuesday nights because someone told them this time might be different. So Amara did what she had always done when the room got harder than it should have been. She put on the navy suit she wore for presentations that mattered. She rehearsed her talking points on the drive downtown, and she walked into Park Tower like she belonged there because she did. The boardroom was exactly as imposing as she'd expected and somehow still managed to be more imposing than that. 12 people around a glass table, the Miami skyline behind them like a backdrop nobody had bothered to remove. And at the head of the table, in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been considered for an hour that morning, sat the man she'd spent 6 weeks calling Tay. He didn't react when she walked in. Not visibly, but she felt it, the half-second where his eyes found her and something in his jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, before the chairman's face settled back into place. The face from the news segment, the face that didn't move. Amara didn't react either. She'd had 2 weeks to decide how this would go, and she'd decided, professional, composed. The work mattered more than the feeling did. She presented for 22 minutes. The plan was simple in the way that good plans are simple. Not because the problem was simple, but because the solution didn't try to be clever about it. A renovated community center with a new courtyard, oriented east-west. A small public plaza. New housing built on 3 vacant parcels the city had owned for decades. Mixed income. Designed to be indistinguishable on the outside from the rest of the block. And, critically, the existing residential blocks, including the one her grandmother and Mr. Curtis lived on, untouched. Not minimized impact. Untouched. This isn't the highest return version of this project, Amara said near the end, looking at the room and not at the man at the head of the table, though she could feel him there the way you can feel a window is open even with your back to it. I know that, but it's the version where, in 20 years, the people who are in this neighborhood today are still in this neighborhood. That's not a soft metric. That's the entire point. There was a pause. And then the vice president of development, a sharp-suited man named Marcus Hale, whom Amara had met exactly once, at a kickoff meeting, where he had referred to her firm's work as the empathy phase, opened his own folder. "We appreciate the community framework," Hale said, in the tone of someone who had practiced sounding like he appreciated things. "And we'd like to propose an alternative that builds on it." He clicked to a rendering that looked nothing like Amara's, taller, denser, the existing blocks replaced by 2 residential towers with a cultural plaza at street level that Amara recognized, instantly, as the kind of space that looked vibrant in a rendering and dead in real life. "Projected returns are roughly double Ms. Whitfield's proposal. We believe the community engagement work can be adapted. A few retained design elements. A naming opportunity for the plaza." Amara felt something go very cold and very still in her chest. Naming opportunity. 11 months distilled into a plaque. The room turned, as rooms like this always eventually turned, toward the head of the table. Theo Park was quiet for longer than Amara expected. Long enough that, for one absurd half-second, she let herself hope, because she knew this man, or she thought she did. She knew that he asked about courtyard orientation and remembered coffee cans and once spent 45 minutes talking about wiring in old houses like it was the most interesting thing in the world. That man would never choose the rendering with the dead plaza. "The revised plan aligns better with our return targets," Theo Park said, in a voice Amara had never heard him use. Flat, final, a voice for closing doors. "We'll proceed with Mr. Hale's proposal. Ms. Whitfield's community engagement framework can be adapted where feasible." Adapted where feasible. Amara had heard that phrase before in other rooms about other projects. It was the phrase that meant nothing dressed up as something. It was the plaque on the dead plaza. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She had spent her whole career learning that arguing with a decision that had already been made, in a room built specifically to make you feel like arguing was useless, was a waste of the only thing she had left to spend, which was her dignity. So she closed her folder. She set down her badge. And she said the only thing that mattered. "I appreciate the opportunity, But I won't be the person who explains to 3,000 families why their homes were the cost of a better view. She walked toward the door, and as she passed the head of the table, close enough that, for 1 second, she could have reached out and touched the ring on his right hand, the one that had belonged to his grandfather, the one he turned when he was thinking. She heard him say her name. Amara. Just that. Quiet. Not the chairman's voice. The other one. She didn't stop. The door closed behind her with the soft, expensive sound of a door that cost more than most people's cars, and the room sat in a silence that none of the 12 people around that table had ever experienced before, because Theo Park's face, for 4 full seconds, which is a very long time in a room like that, had changed. Amara drove back to Liberty City with the radio off. She didn't go to her office. She went to her grandmother's house, the one on the block that, as of an hour ago, was no longer part of any plan she'd had any say over. Miss Odessa was on the porch, watering the bird of paradise in their coffee cans. And she took one look at Amara's face and didn't ask anything. She just moved over on the porch swing, making room. They picked the towers, Amara said eventually. 11 months. And they picked the towers. Miss Odessa nodded slowly, the way she nodded at things that didn't surprise her but still hurt. Baby, she said after a while. You can't fix a house for people who were already planning to burn it down for the insurance money. You did what you came to do. You made sure they couldn't say nobody told them what it had cost. Amara leaned her head on her grandmother's shoulder and didn't say anything else for a long time. Over the following weeks, she didn't watch the news. She started getting calls from a number she didn't recognize day after day, and after the third one she blocked it without listening to the voicemail. An email arrived from a Park Holdings address requesting a follow-up consultation regarding the Bayshore Rising Community Framework. She had her office manager respond with 2 sentences, polite and final, declining. Instead, she did what she'd always done when the rooms got smaller than they should have been. She helped Mr. Curtis's block organize historic designation paperwork, zoning variance hearings, the slow, unglamorous work of making it harder procedurally for 2 towers to simply erase a street. She told her best friend, Brielle, the short version over wine one night. There was a guy, it doesn't matter, he turned out to be exactly who you'd expect. And Brielle, who had her own things going on that she wasn't quite ready to talk about either, just topped off Amara's glass and let it be enough for one night. Amara told herself she'd done the right thing. She believed it, mostly. But some nights, she found herself thinking about a man who remembered there were 3 coffee cans, not 2, and wondering whether any of it had been real, or whether she'd just been the most thorough site visit he'd ever done. If you've ever walked away from something, a job, a deal, a relationship, because staying would have cost you the part of yourself you actually liked, drop a comment and tell me about it. I read every single one. And if you think Theo Park just made the worst mistake of his life, you have absolutely no idea yet. Keep watching. For 3 weeks after the vote, Theo Park was, by every account inside Park Holdings, fine. He approved the Bayshore Rising final budget. He sat through the press cycle, Park Holdings chairman's surprising new Miami venture, analysts calling it a return to form for the notoriously profit-driven Park strategy, without comment, which was normal, because Theo Park never commented on anything. He attended the quarterly board dinner where he said exactly as much as he usually said, which was very little, and left exactly when he usually left, which was early. But his assistant of 9 years, a woman named Grace Munn who had outlasted 3 reorganizations and 1 attempted boardroom coup specifically because she was the only person who could read Theo Park's silences accurately, noticed something. He'd stopped turning his ring. It was such a small thing that she almost didn't trust herself for noticing it. But Theo Park turned that ring constantly, in meetings, on calls, during the long silences before he said the one sentence that decided everything. It was the only visible tell he had, and it had been there for as long as Grace had worked for him. And now, for 3 weeks, his hands were just still, folded, wrong. He'd also started doing something he had never, in 9 years, done before. He asked Grace to pull a file that had nothing to do with anything on his calendar. The original community engagement report for Bayshore Rising. The full version. Not the executive summary Hale's team had circulated. The one that had been trimmed to 40 pages and reorganized around key opportunities for value-add integration. The full version. All 412 pages of it. He read it over 2 nights, alone, in his apartment on Brickell that had a better view of the bay than almost any other apartment in the city, and that he had lived in for 6 years without ever hanging a single picture. It was, in places, exactly what he'd expected: survey data, demographic breakdowns, traffic studies. But it was also full of things that had never made it into any boardroom, because nobody in a boardroom had ever asked. Direct quotes from residents, transcribed and attributed by first name only. A section 3 pages long just about Earl Curtis's repair shop, how long he'd run it, how many people in the neighborhood had learned basic electronics from him for free over the decades. A quote from a teenager who said, "Mr. Curtis taught me how a circuit works before any teacher did, and he never made me feel dumb for asking twice." And in the appendix, a hand-drawn sketch. Amara's handwriting, he recognized it now. The same handwriting from the notes she'd taken during their conversations. Though he hadn't known it was hers then. A small courtyard. A row of planters along one wall. And a note, underlined twice. "Bird of paradise. Ask community if there's significance." Follow up. Ran out of time in session 3. She never got to ask. The meeting had moved on before she could. And then the towers had moved on, too, and the question, the actual human question, the one thing in 412 pages that read less like a planning document and more like a woman trying to make sure something small but true didn't get lost, had simply stopped existing the way most true things stopped existing in rooms like the ones Theo Park spent his life in. He sat with that for a long time. The next morning, he did something he had not done since he was a teenager, before the company, before any of it. He took the train. He got off near Liberty City and walked the blocks slated for Hales Towers, alone, in a plain jacket, with no security and no driver and no plan beyond seeing it. Actually seeing it the way Amara had seen it, the way he'd convinced himself for years that he saw things too, when really he'd only ever seen the version of things that came pre-translated into numbers. He walked past Earl Curtis's repair shop. Through the window, he could see the old man at his workbench, a radio in pieces in front of him, working with the unhurried focus of someone who had nowhere else he needed to be and nothing to prove to anyone about it. He walked past a house with a porch, 3 coffee cans of Bird of Paradise lined up along the railing, and an older woman sitting on a swing, watching the street the way people watch a street they've watched for 50 years. Not with suspicion, just with the quiet attention of someone keeping an eye on something they love. He didn't go up to the porch. He didn't introduce himself. He just stood across the street for a long time, in the heat, in a jacket that was suddenly far too warm for Miami, and then he turned around and went back to the train. What happened over the following 6 weeks was, internally, described by people who worked closely with Theo Park as the reversal, and externally, by the few outlets that caught wind of it, as Park Holdings' surprising about-face. It was neither simple nor cheap. The investors who'd backed Hales Towers had done so on the basis of specific return projections, and walking those projections back toward Amara's original plan, in full, not adapted, not where feasible, meant Theo Park personally guaranteeing a return floor that, if the project underperformed, would come out of his own holdings before it touched a single outside investor. 2 board members who had championed Hales' version pushed back, hard, in language that, for the first time in 15 years, Theo Park let himself actually hear instead of simply outlasting. He didn't argue with them. He told them, in the same flat voice he'd used in that boardroom weeks earlier, that the decision was made, and that if they had concerns about his judgment going forward, the board could revisit his role at the next scheduled review. Nobody pushed further after that. Not because they were afraid of him, though they were, but because something in the way he said it made it clear that, for once, he genuinely did not care what they thought. The reversal went through Hales' office, framed as a board reconsideration informed by ongoing community feedback and updated risk modeling. Theo's name appeared nowhere in the press release. He made sure of that. And then, quietly, through a separate small entity that didn't share Park Holdings' name or branding, something he'd used for years for the houses, he began funding, and occasionally overseeing in person, the restoration of one specific building within the project footprint. The community center itself. Not the version in Hales' renderings. The version from Amara's original sketch. He hired local contractors. He visited the site himself, dressed the way he dressed the night he met Mr. Curtis, introducing himself simply as a project consultant doing a walkthrough. A sentence that was, he reflected, becoming something of a habit and also, increasingly, the only version of himself he actually recognized. He had Bird of Paradise planted along the courtyard wall. The same orientation Amara had specified, east-west, morning shade and evening shade, and in the corner of the building, where Amara had once said, almost as a joke, that there was nowhere quiet, just folding chairs and bad AC. He had a small room framed in good light, good shelves, the kind of room that didn't announce itself. He left a space on the wall near the door for a plaque. He didn't know what it should say. It didn't feel like his decision to make. Okay, if you're not subscribed yet, now's the time, and make sure that notification bell is on. Because what happens next is the moment this entire story turns. You don't want to find out about it a day late. Let's get into it. Word moves fast in a neighborhood that's used to bad news, and slower, but just as surely when the news is good. It started as rumor. Someone had heard from someone at the zoning office that the towers were on hold. Then someone else heard the community center renovation had restarted with a different crew working off plans that looked, according to someone's cousin who'd seen them, a lot like the ones from those Tuesday night meetings, the ones everyone had stopped expecting anything from. Amara heard it from Mr. Curtis himself, who stopped by Whitfield Collaborative storefront office on a Thursday afternoon, still in his work apron, smelling faintly of solder. "They're building your courtyard," he said, without preamble, the way Mr. Curtis said most things. "The one with the trees in the right spots. Somebody go down there and look, because I don't believe it till I see your name on it." Amara didn't believe it either, but she went. The community center looked different already. Scaffolding along one side, but the original facade preserved, not demolished. The courtyard was roughed in, and along one wall, recently planted, still small but unmistakable, was a row of bird of paradise. East-west orientation. Morning shade, evening shade. She stood there for a long moment, feeling something complicated rise in her chest. Not quite hope, because hope had cost her enough already, but something adjacent to it, something that wanted to be careful. Inside, past the scaffolding, she could hear someone working, the particular sound of a level being checked, a shelf bracket being adjusted, a quiet correction. She followed the sound to a corner room she didn't recognize from the original building, because it hadn't existed in the original building. Good light, shelves going up along two walls, and a man in work clothes, sleeves rolled to the elbow, holding a shelf level against the wall while a contractor marked a line. He turned around. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The contractor, sensing something, mumbled something about checking on the next delivery and left. "You're not supposed to be here," Amara said finally. It wasn't an accusation. It was the only sentence that came out. "I'm a project consultant," Theo said, "doing a walkthrough. You're the chairman of the company that owns this project." "I'm aware those aren't mutually exclusive technically," he said, and there was something in his voice. Not quite a joke, but close to one, closer than the boardroom voice had ever come. "Though I understand it's a stretch." Amara looked around the room, at the shelves, at the light, at him, standing in the middle of it in clothes that had actual dust on them, which she was fairly sure had never happened to Theo Park in any photograph in 15 years. "I read your report," he said, before she could ask anything else. "The full version, 412 pages. I read about Mr. Curtis's shop, and the kid who said he learned how a circuit worked before any teacher taught him. And I found the sketch. In the appendix." He paused. "The note about the bird of paradise. You never got to ask why it mattered, so I didn't ask either. I just planted them in the spot you drew them. I figured if you ever saw them, you'd explain it if you wanted to. And if you never saw them, then at least they'd be there anyway, because you were right about where they should go." Amara was quiet for a long time. "Why?" she said finally. "Not why the flowers. Why all of it." Theo set down the level. For the first time since she'd known him, as the chairman, as whatever he was standing in front of her now, he didn't seem to be choosing his words from a list of approved options. He just said them. "Because I sat in that room and I had 15 years of practice being the person that room expected me to be, and I was that person for exactly long enough to lose the only thing in those 15 years that had felt real to me. I can't undo that day. I know that. I know it cost you something, and I know an apology doesn't put it back. But I could undo the decision. So I did. Quietly, because it wasn't about getting credit. I genuinely didn't think I'd earned any. It was just the right version of the project. The one that existed before I sat down at that table and chose the wrong one." Amara looked at the shelves, at the empty space on the wall near the door, where something, A plaque, she realized, was clearly meant to go, and didn't yet. "You let me think nothing changed your mind," she said. "That it was just bureaucracy, public pressure, the zoning fight." "I know," Theo said. "I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything for the company finally doing what it should have done from the start. That wasn't a gift. It was the floor. You shouldn't have to be grateful for the floor." It wasn't an excuse, and Amara understood, looking at him, that he hadn't offered it as one. It was just true, the way most things he said to her had turned out to be true, even the ones that had hurt the most. "You actually listened," she said. "This whole time. Even when it mattered, you'd already heard everything. You just didn't act on it until it cost you something to not act." "I always listened," Theo said. "I just didn't understand. Until that room. That listening and acting are different things. And that I'd spent my whole life mistaking one for the other." He glanced at the empty wall near the door. "I didn't know what to put there. Felt like it should be your decision. Everything in this room was your design before it was anything I touched." The Odessa Whitfield reading room opened 4 months later, on a Saturday morning, with folding chairs from 3 different churches set up in the courtyard because some traditions were worth keeping even when you could afford new ones. Miss Odessa cut the ribbon herself. In a hat she'd been saving for an occasion she said she didn't know she'd been waiting for until it arrived. Mr. Curtis got his repair shop storefront included in the community ownership program Amara had insisted on from the start. Not adapted where feasible, but written into the agreement before either party signed anything. Theo Park attended. Not as the chairman, not as an investor, not as anyone with a title at all. He stood near the back, the way he had the first time, in a plain shirt with no name tag, and when a local photographer happened to catch him in a wide shot of the crowd, watching Amara explain the new courtyard to a group of kids from the after-school program, something in his face had changed in a way that, when the photo ran in a small community newsletter 2 weeks later with the caption "Bayshore Rising Community Day," made exactly one financial reporter do a double take and spend an entire afternoon trying to confirm it was really him. It was. The glacier was smiling. Just slightly. The kind of smile that only happened when nobody important was supposed to be watching. Months passed. The reading room filled with donated books faster than anyone had budgeted shelf space for. Mr. Curtis started teaching a free Saturday electronics class for neighborhood kids. In the same corner he'd always worked from, except now with better lighting and a sign with his name on it that he pretended to be embarrassed by and clearly was not. And one evening, in the courtyard, among the bird of paradise that had grown taller than anyone expected in just a few months, Theo asked Amara something that wasn't quite a question about the two of them, though it was that too. "Park Holdings has 2 more projects in early planning," he said. "Different cities. I want you to lead community design on both, not after the fact this time. From the start. With the kind of authority you should have had on this one from the beginning." Amara looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had once told her, in a parking lot, that there was something he needed to be honest with her about, and who had taken 3 months and one very expensive mistake to actually get there. "I'll think about it," she said. And Theo, who had spent 15 years getting immediate answers to every question he'd ever asked, found, for the second time in his life, that he didn't mind waiting at all. And that's where we'll leave it for today. If the story hit something for you, if you've ever been the person who walked away, or the person who had to earn their way back, let me know in the comments, because those stories are usually the best ones and I want to hear yours. Thank you for spending an hour with this story. See you in the next one.